I didn't have college, but I was like in the field when I started. All right, thank you everyone for coming. We're about to get started. So it is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Kathleen Farley from the Missouri Botanical Garden, who is a research scientist at the William L. Brown Center. So Dr. Farley got her bachelor's degree from the Environmental Science and Public Policy at Harvard University, then went on to get a master's in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies in Yale University, and then another master's in Department of Anthropology here at Washington University in St. Louis. She recently completed her PhD from the Department of Anthropology from Washington University in St. Louis in 2022, working with Glenstone. And so her research is on cultural anthropology, which is interested in how rural communities harvest and use plants. And today she will give us a seminar on listening to local folk conservation among wild plant harvesters in rural Appalachia. And so Dr. Farley, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. If you will bear with me, I am trying to share the screen properly so that everybody who is on YouTube can see what I am talking about. So just 1 second, and let's see if we can get this screen share happening the way it is supposed to. All right, well, it seems like it does not want to let me see my notes in presenter mode, so I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way and have my paper notes. Great. So thank everybody so much for coming and listening to me. Sorry, camera? Yeah, I'm working on that. Oh, tech issues. There we go. Start video. All right, now everybody can see me, hopefully. Great, yeah. Okay. Great. So thank you, and my apologies for the technical difficulties here, for coming to listen to today's talk. And thank you so much to the Living Earth Collaborative and to WashU for giving me this opportunity to come and share my work with all of you today. As the introduction said, I'm Kate Farley. I'm an assistant scientist at the William L. Brown Center at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And my research, it focuses on the relationships between useful plants and people and the environments in which the plants and the people live. And so I just graduated from WashU over the summer. And so the research that I'm going to be sharing with you today is research that mainly comes from what I completed for my dissertation. And to start off with, since most of you in the audience here are probably biologists, I just want to start off by explaining what it is I actually do as a cultural anthropologist. Like I said, I'm interested in the relationships between the human and the non-human, or as some anthropologists like to put it, the more than human world. So the kinds of cultural meanings that people create out of the things that they see in the world around them, and how this relates to big structural forces that organize our lives, like politics and economics. And so to do this, I study this by doing narrow but deep case studies. So we spend extensive amounts of time in the field, living with and working alongside and talking to the people who are in the communities that we're interested in. So in my case, I spent about 22 cumulative months of living primarily in the mountains of Western North Carolina and a bit in Southern West Virginia and surrounding states. And I was working alongside people who rely on medicinal plants for at least part of their livelihoods. And so with this kind of work, you're sort of giving up the kind of statistical power that you might be getting from having large sample sizes, but you get depth and nuance and the ability to tell a deeper story about a particular case and a particular point in place in time. And that, I don't know why that, okay. So medicinal and aromatic plants are a huge industry. So over $20 billion annually, according to one UN estimate. And these are plants that are used in everything from pharmaceuticals to traditional medicines to sports supplements, cosmetics, food flavorings, and more. I mean, it might seem surprising in our sort of urbanized, industrialized world in which we interact on a day-to-day basis, but somewhere between 60 and 90% of the medicinal and aromatic plants in global trade today are still harvested from the wild. And many of these commercially important plants are actually native to North America, and specifically to the Appalachian Mountains. And so this slide shows a small sample of some of the species that I encountered when I was in the field that are regularly harvested, bought, sold by small-scale root diggers and brokers, and they include, certainly not limited to, golden seal, black cohosh, false unicorn, my interlocutors often call this star root or star grub, Solomon seal, bloodroot, slippery elm. And if you walk into, the Whole Foods that's in the Central West End today, or your average, health food co-op, you could find products containing any of these plants. And a lot of them probably were originally harvested from the wild in Appalachia. But the plant that I want to focus on today is American ginseng, Panax quinquefolius, which is in the Araliaceae or the ivy family. And ginseng is most commonly associated with traditional Chinese medicine, but this species is actually native to the temperate forests of Eastern North America. And it's very closely related to Panax ginseng, which is the species that's found in northeastern China and the Korean Peninsula. And it's used medicinally in very similar ways. And truly wild ginseng can sell for a lot of money. Last season, a pound of dried wild American ginseng sold for over $1,000 in some places. And so it's an understory herb that grows in moist, well-drained soil, and it's very slow growing and long-lived. It can take in the wild as much as 10 to 12 years in order for it to produce enough viable seed to reliably reproduce. The root in this photo is actually over 50 years old. You can count it by the scars from they call them the bud scars from the leaves that it sends up every spring and die off every fall. I've heard rumors of people finding specimens that are even older than that. Most of the roots on the market are in the 7 to 15 year-ish range that are wild. They get more valuable the older they are. And legal harvest seasons are designated in order to give wild ginseng seeds enough time to mature. And that usually happens in around actually this time of year. So the season starts in early September, beginning of September, and when the berries are red and ripe. And so it's used in a variety of different ways. The genus name Panax, it's the same root as panacea or cure-all. So that kind of gives you a hint of what it could be used for. So in traditional Chinese medicine, it's a tonic that enhances qi or vital life energy. So it strengthens the energy that is thought to naturally flow through the body and directs it towards whatever body parts or systems might need it the most. One TCM doctor explained to me that American ginseng is particularly helpful for modern urban people who work all the time because it can help enhance our energy without overly taxing our systems in an already stressful environment. So I actually took American ginseng extract when I was working on my dissertation. Maybe it was the placebo effect, but I think it helped. But it's also thought to increase longevity, and it's a high prestige gift, which is what supports these incredibly high prices that you see for wild ginseng. In Western botanical medicine, it's an adaptogen, an herb that helps the body adapt to stress. Sometimes you see it in energy drinks because it will, or sport supplements because it enhances energy. And in Appalachia, it's used in a few ways. One of my interlocutors told me the leaves are medicine and the roots are money. So they'd sell the roots and then use the leaves or the bits of broken root that weren't worth very much and use it to make teeth. They'd chew on the roots or the leaves to get an extra boost of energy or to reduce feelings of hunger and thirst when you are out in the woods. And so this map shows all of the counties where there's a record of wild ginseng being legally harvested. The actual range is actually a bit more extensive than this, goes up into Michigan, into Canada. But you'll notice that the ginseng harvests are concentrated in this area that is sort of southern West Virginia, a bit of Kentucky, a bit of Southwest Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee. And so for the purposes of today's talk, we can sort of think of this as America's core ginseng region. It's relatively abundant in this area, and there's an active culture of ginseng harvesting where there's knowledge about how to harvest, how to find these plants passed down from one generation to the next. And it's also supported by a network of small-scale ginseng buyers who have connections with larger aggregators and exporters who will ship ginseng primarily to East Asia. In this core ginseng region that I just identified on the previous slide, it's interesting because it overlaps almost perfectly with the cultural region of Appalachia, which I've highlighted in red on this slide. And there's no one single definition of what constitutes Appalachia. Geologically, the Appalachian Mountains go all the way up to Canada. Legally, the government recognizes 423 counties belonging to Appalachia, and that goes as far as the southern tier of New York State. Culturally, though, the geographic range commonly associated with Appalachia more or less corresponds with what I'm showing on this map here. It's not a homogeneous region by any means whatsoever, but there's enough shared cultural, geological, historic, and economic similarities across the region to make it worth talking about as sort of more or less a distinct unit. So it's got very rugged terrain with mountain ridges that make it very difficult to travel from east to west. It's a lot easier to travel north to south. The earliest white settlers were farmers and trappers who were mainly priced out of the better farmland further east. A lot of locals will claim them as their Scots-Irish ancestors, referring to the Protestants who immigrated from Northern Ireland in the 18th and 19th centuries. Immigration patterns were, of course, a lot more complex than that. But it's also a region that is incredibly rich in natural resources. But paradoxically, local residents rarely benefit from that wealth, leaving this region with one of the highest poverty rates in the United States. And a lot of observers, scholars of Appalachian studies have referred to it as an internal colony. I should also point out, I'm calling it Appalachia. I grew up in the New York City suburbs calling it Appalachia, like I'm going to go for a hike on the Appalachian Trail. But that was my first night in West Virginia. Somebody nipped that in the bud. And so the region on this map actually more or less corresponds with the region where people will pronounce it, Appalachia. So that's also sort of a marker of what counts as Appalachia. So this slide contains a lot of common images that come to mind in American popular culture when people think about Appalachia, and they're not particularly flattering, especially if you are an urban, highly educated, probably politically progressive person, like I maybe assume a lot of people in this room are. Words that might come to mind might be coal mines, poverty, opioid epidemic, Trump voters, guns, hillbillies. Some of this does have roots in reality. In central Appalachia, you've got about 23% of residents below the poverty line compared to about 13% for America as a whole. But these words and images, they're connected to stereotypes about sort of the archetypal resident of Appalachia, the hillbilly. And in images, the hillbilly, you sort of see these cartoonish caricatures, with a beard and patched overalls and a jug of moonshine. But then it also gets sort of reflected in popular media in sort of these news articles. You might call them poverty porn, like the large image that's on this slide here. This was published in The Guardian just a couple of years ago. And it reinforces a lot of assumptions that people have about people in this region, that they're uneducated or ignorant, violent, prone to substance abuse, whether that's opioids or moonshine or methamphetamines. And there's an implication as well that rampant poverty in the region is somehow something that people brought on this themselves, sort of a rural version of the culture of poverty thesis. If you've ever seen the movie or read the book Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, that's a very clear implication that he is making in that book there, that somehow this is people's fault. In the words of one of my interlocutors, who's a coal miner in Eastern Kentucky, the culture of Appalachian people, probably next to the Native American cultures, we are probably the most maligned culture in this country. But at the same time, Appalachia has experienced a tremendous amount of environmental damage. So this is actually a photo that I took of a mountaintop removal coal mine. And the photos can't really convey the scale of these things. These are absolutely enormous. And so scholars in Appalachian studies have made the argument that it's basically an internal colony of the United States. So despite Appalachia's poverty, it's got all of these natural resources, so timber, coal, minerals, ginseng, and recreational opportunities. But very little of this wealth is making its way back to the people who have been living there for generations. So you have these external investors who are extracting this wealth and funneling it to metropolitan centers, and then using the locals for labor when needed and discarding them when the forest is cut down or when the mines give out. And then leaving the people to deal with the environmental consequences. And so there's an argument to be made that the hillbilly stereotype kind of makes it easier to do this kind of destructive, extractive activity. Oh, we're sacrificing this region for the greater good. It's just a bunch of hillbillies who live there anyway, who cares? And so like a lot of environmental justice issues, it's poor communities who are bearing the brunt of pollution and habitat loss. And so this kind of destruction is especially hard on many rural Appalachian communities where people still rely on resources from the forest in order to survive. Many people rely on meat they hunt themselves to feed their families and make extra cash by harvesting in-demand wild edibles and medicinals. So including some of the plants that I have just been talking about so far, ginseng, other medicinals, but also things like morel mushrooms and ramps. And that's one of the ways that people cobble together a livelihood. It's also a really beautiful place. I didn't want to leave you guys with the impression that it's just all dark and depressing all the time. So I just wanted to show you just a few quick images of just how absolutely lovely a lot of Appalachia really is. Beautiful forested landscapes and mountains, wildflowers, wildlife, morel mushrooms. If you like mushroom hunting, it's really, really great area. But yeah, so it's actually quite a beautiful place despite all of the hardship. And so given that this region has high rates of poverty and few available good living wage jobs and a lot of forested land, it makes sense that a significant number of people might try to make money in the informal economy by utilizing forest resources. So these resources, wild game, fruits, greens, mushrooms, for personal use, but also sold. And so ginseng is part of this forest-based economy. And this is how the supply chain basically works. So first, the harvester will dig the plant. And there's specific rules about where and when the plants can be dug. Official rules are often ignored, which I will talk about in a bit. And then you take your roots to a dealer. Lots of small scale dealers all over Appalachia. This is just the logo for one of them. Historically, a lot of them actually also have dealt in furs. And a lot of them are also scrap metal dealers, which is sort of odd. Spent a lot of time in like junkyards and scrap metal shops talking to these dealers. And they'll buy other herbs, not just ginseng, but ginseng's usually the big money maker. And then dealers will send them to an exporter. Sometimes exporters will buy directly from diggers, so it'll kind of, cut out one step of this process. They'll be graded, the roots will be graded by size and quality and exported according to the rules in CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna. And then most American ginseng is actually exported to Hong Kong specifically. Even most of the American ginseng that you can buy here in the United States has been re-imported. And then it will go to the retailers and then finally to consumers. And so the problem with American ginseng is that it is increasingly scarce. I continually hear stories about how ginseng was abundant long ago, but that's no longer the case. So one retired Forest Service worker told me in the 1700s, it was one of the dominant species in rich cove forests. Whereas now, if you find ginseng, it's an Easter egg, dance a jig. A ginseng harvester near Boone, North Carolina explained it's becoming more scarce while demand is doing nothing but going up. So as a result, prices are steadily increasing over time, just supply and demand. And that further increases the incentive for people to go out and harvest ginseng. So in essence, this appears to be a classic case of the tragedy of the commons. So wild harvesters tend to treat Appalachian forests as a de facto commons, usually regardless of who actually owns the deed to the land. But if this is a tragedy of the commons scenario, then harvesters would have an incentive to maximize harvests because individual rational actors, they would profit more from harvests in the short run than in conservation in the long run. And so the numbers, if you look at them, they do seem to be consistent with the idea that this is a tragedy of the commons. So this graph's adapted from a 2019 paper by Schmidt et al. In Biological Conservation. The top chart shows the average price of ginseng increasing over time from under $100 a pound in the 80s to over $400 a pound in their most recent, whatever they took their most recent numbers from, but prices have increased even more since then. And these other graphs include our estimates for the amount of ginseng harvested over time by state. And so there's different axes just because of different states have different volumes of ginseng harvested. So that's why they're on different graphs, so they can just show the different scales on the y-axis. And so note that in most of these states, there is an overall downward trend in the volume of ginseng that is being harvested from year to year. And so one interpretation of this is that these ginseng harvests are declining because there's just simply not enough ginseng out there to meet the demand because it has been over harvested, that it's just all been taken out of the woods already. And so if ginseng in the wild is in decline, then why not just cultivate it on farms and meet the demand that way? That's sort of a potential classic solution to the tragedy of the commons. You take something out of the commons, basically, and you grow it on private farms. To some extent, this does happen. In terms of sheer volume, actually, most American ginseng is grown on large-scale farms in the upper Midwest, mainly in Wisconsin and also in Canada. But part of the issue is that it is so much more valuable to have wild ginseng as opposed to farmed ginseng. And that's because that there are a lot of morphological differences between farmed and wild roots. So on the left, that's a ginseng farm in Ontario. It's a monocrop, lights carefully controlled with shade cloth. Get roots in as little as 5 years that kind of look like this. They sort of look like, hairy parsnips, I guess. And you might get $20, $30 a pound for something like this. But in the wild, on the other side, that's what, typical good ginseng environment might look like in the wild. And, sort of these shady forest areas, a lot of growth in the understory. And then you get roots that look kind of like this. They're a lot twistier, they're less uniform. You get these, they're darker in color. You get these wrinkles or striations on the outside of the root that my interlocutors will point to as wild character. This root has a lot of wild character. And that will sell for $1,000 a pound. Depending on the year, sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less if it's deemed to be, not as good quality. But yeah, $1,000 a pound, around that range. And there is an intermediate thing, they'll call it wild simulated ginseng. They'll mimic natural growing conditions as much as possible you're basically controlling your growing environment to produce roots that look wild, even though they are technically cultivated. Which is certainly something that is worth thinking about. But the challenge is that to do this at a commercial scale, it would be out of reach for a lot of the poor harvesters who rely on harvested wild ginseng for supplementary income. As one woman I interviewed put it, she said, this whole forest farming thing is bullshit because she owns 1/16 of an acre and she can't afford to lease adjacent land where she otherwise would be able to grow wild simulated ginseng. And so the most common narrative explanation that pops up for this is that it's just the fault of diggers who dig too much and too indiscriminately. Most of my interlocutors would never use the phrase tragedy of the commons, but in essence, this is what they're talking about. So a good example came from a participant in a workshop on ginseng for landowners in Virginia that I attended. It's an instant gratification thing. They don't look at the future, they want it now, they want their money now. They don't see the benefit of waiting a couple more years for something to grow. And also, I think a lot of it is the drugs. They go in, they get it, they sell it, and they buy up their drugs. So this quotation exemplifies a lot of the explanations that I heard from landowners, foresters, environmentalists, other interested parties about ginseng overharvesting, that just people don't care about nature. They don't care about the health of ecosystems. They just want to make a quick buck, and they don't care if they're ruining it for the future. Especially the idea that they're using this to buy drugs came up a lot. It has this tinge of morality that seems to be a little more immoral than if they were just buying, needing it to buy like food or fuel or something like that. And so, in short, it's placing the blame for ginseng population decline on local Appalachian harvesters. And if you remember this discussion of this hillbilly stereotype from the beginning, it kind of reinforces this narrative of rural Appalachians as ignorant and lazy and prone to vice. And I was not satisfied with this narrative. Environmentalists have a long history of blaming local communities who rely on natural resources for supposedly damaging or ruining the pristine wilderness. That's how you get sometimes called fortress conservation. It's basically putting a fence around nature and telling everybody to keep out. And such policies can be harmful because they not only prevent local communities from accessing important resources, but they also ignore the fact that many supposedly pristine or wild landscapes are actually the product of careful human management over a very long period of time. And so the official government agency-driven response to all of this is to limit the amount of ginseng that can be harvested and the manner in which it is harvested. It's regulated on a state-by-state basis using rules that are developed and enforced by state departments of fish and wildlife. It's a lot like the regulations that might cover something like deer hunting or other forms of hunting. So that it has to can only be harvested in season. It starts on September 1st. Plants have to be a certain age. The neck or the portion of the root that shows the scars from the previous years, that has to be intact so that you can show how old it is. Ripe seeds have to be planted in the immediate vicinity of where the ginseng plant was harvested. You can't just take them and then move them elsewhere. And many of these regulations are routinely ignored or only have partial compliance. And over again, I heard ginseng diggers express a lot of frustration with some of these regulations. Basically, frustration that they weren't consulted and frustration with the fact that a lot of it seems to be a very one-size-fits-all approach that in their view was put in place by a bunch of bureaucrats and ivory tower scientists who have no idea what conditions are actually like on the ground. And so for the purposes of this project, I decided to take their point of view seriously and learn about how ginseng harvesters themselves approach conservation. Which brings me to this question so how do wild ginseng harvesters think about and manage the threat of overharvesting? And then what can we learn about their approaches in order to maybe create better and more effective ways of conserving ginseng and perhaps other important non-timber forest products? So in essence, I'm interested in Appalachian traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, regarding ginseng. And so TEK is the idea that indigenous or local people who have been living in one place for a long time hold important knowledge about how to sustainably live as part of their surrounding environment. And most studies of TEK focus on indigenous people, or agrarian communities in the global South. So does it make sense to talk about Appalachian TEK, especially given the negative stereotypes about Appalachians that are still abound in the American popular imagination? It sort of makes sense that this Appalachian traditional ecological knowledge might have been overlooked or dismissed. And so how I did this, like I said before, I am a cultural anthropologist. So I use a combination of in-depth interviews and informal interviews and just spending a lot of time working and socializing with my interlocutors to figure out what is going on. So I spent about 22 months cumulatively in the field, about one solid period of about 18 months when I did the bulk of this work, plus some preliminary time and follow-up trips. About 60 semi-structured interviews and with interlocutors in 4 categories that overlap. So wild harvesters, wild simulated growers, buyers and exporters, and other, which includes landowners, policymakers, environmentalists, other stakeholders who don't sort of neatly fit into the other categories. And then I also conducted many informal interviews and engaged in participant observation, which anthropologists will sometimes refer to in a tongue-in-cheek way as deep hanging out. Basically, you spend time with people and take notes about it. So working side by side with people or shadowing people to get firsthand experience into what their lives are actually like. So you can help generate new insights about, think about questions to ask in interviews and maybe even see where there's contradictions between what people are telling you in interviews and what you observe them actually doing. And so when I started this project, one of the biggest concerns I heard from advisors and mentors was how was I going to recruit participants? Ginseng harvesters are often secretive because they don't want people knowing where their like secret ginseng spots are. If you've ever met mushroom hunters, they can be very much the same way. And on top of that, a lot of ginseng harvesters dig illegally in one way or another and are wary of authority figures. And then third, ginseng is also a very male-dominated industry. So how was I, a young woman who was clearly not born in Appalachia, going to get access to this community? So I ended up reaching out mainly to official lists of ginseng dealers because they're all available from state websites. Social media also was a surprisingly very useful strategy for contacting people who were willing to talk to me. There's very active groups on Facebook, weirdly, for ginseng, diggers and dealers to exchange information. And then snowball sampling, which is basically when you talk to somebody and then you ask them who do they know who might want to talk to you too, and you kind of snowball from there. So basically, you're relying on people's existing social networks in order to find more participants. And so over and over again, I heard from landowners and farmers and environmentalists, people who don't regularly harvest wild ginseng, that it's, so like over harvested because people want to, get this quick cash. But after spending a few days out in the woods with folks, I can tell you, it is not an easy way to get some quick cash. It is hard work. Many ginseng harvesters are actually concerned, hear this a lot, that the younger generations don't want to dig ginseng anymore because it's too hard work. So which sort of, I guess it's like the constant thing, right? Is the older generations complaining that younger generations are lazy. But I've included a few quotes from some of my interlocutors just to illustrate this, how hard it is. So one person saying, every day I'm in the woods for 8-10 hours, like daylight to dark. If I'm capable of doing it, that's what I do. But that's how you're gonna make anything, because you're gonna have to walk at least 5 or 10 miles each hike to really amass anything. One person said, to dig ginseng, you have to be half billy goat and all hillbilly. And then another person said, only crazy people are going to go where they could die, but that's where the ginseng thrives. That's where the beautiful plants are. And this person's referring to the fact that a lot of the time it's at the tops of cliffs or in places that are otherwise difficult to access because that's what hasn't been dug out already. So it's physically taxing. It involves a lot of skill in identifying plants and in navigating the woods because there aren't any trails a lot of the time where people are going. Managing hazards from rattlesnakes to the weather to cliffs. So yeah, ginseng digging is a way to make money in a place where good jobs are hard to come by. It's also an option if you have a criminal record or if you don't think that you would be capable of passing a drug test that a lot of low-wage jobs require. And that's a barrier to formal employment for many people. but it's also not an easy way to make money. And people aren't going to be successful if they don't already have the skills and inclination to spend that much time in the woods. I heard plenty of stories of people who thought they'd go and find some of that quote unquote mountain gold and make a fortune, and then just give up when they realized how much work it was. And so when I talked to ginseng harvesters themselves, I heard much more diverse stories about what might be causing the decline in ginseng populations than just overharvesting. One of the big ones actually was deer. White-tailed deer like to eat ginseng, and their populations are dramatically greater in Appalachia compared to just a few decades ago. Anybody who has a garden around these parts is probably very familiar with this. Even here. So, but yeah, so deer browse, major threat to ginseng. Habitat loss, that's another huge one. So think back to that image that I showed before of the mountaintop removal site. So timber harvesting, coal mining, these are dramatic destructive land uses that are obviously harming ginseng habitat. And then there's other stuff too that's maybe a little more subtle. So you get residential and recreational development, which is a huge issue near tourist destinations like Smoky Mountain National Park. But then there's also stuff like natural gas well access roads. They're not necessarily destroying habitat in such a dramatic way, but they're making it a lot easier for people to access parts of the woods that otherwise would be very difficult to get to. Climate change is another one, which is sort of interesting. Many of my interlocutors are very politically conservative. So this might be a little bit of a surprise, but if you talk to them, if you ask them directly about climate change, they would probably say hands down, they say hands down, oh yeah, no, climate's not changing. But then with a little bit more questioning, they spend a lot of time outside and they observe the weather very closely. So they're observing that the trees are leafing out, a few weeks earlier in the spring, and the leaves are turning color a few weeks later in the fall. They know the weather's changing, even if that statement is going to come with a lot of hemming and hawing about, we don't know why it's happening, but it is changing. And so the main concern is the changing weather's impact on things like berry ripening times and how that impacts, the seed viability. TV and social media, that's another concern, mainly directed at this one particular TV show called Appalachian Outlaws, which ran on the History Channel in 2011 and 2012. And it dramatized the lives of a few ginseng hunters, really promoted this idea that the woods are full of mountain gold and anyone who can go out and find it. And as a result, a lot of people who don't have the knowledge or skills to correctly and safely harvest ginseng got out there, and in some cases did quite a bit of damage by harvesting indiscriminately. One person even told me about a dealer, told me about one of these novice ginseng hunters who brought in a whole bucket load full of what he thought was ginseng roots, but it was actually Jack in the Pulpit, which has similar red berries, but just it looks like a totally different plant. So it's been a few years since these shows were on the air, and their influence does seem to be dying down. Some of my interlocutors have told me that they're seeing a lot of young plants in areas where that were previously decimated by these TV show fans. So there's signs it's coming back. And then finally, regulations. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of frustration that these ginseng regulations are very one size fits all and prohibit some of these folk conservation practices. So there's a lot of frustration that these regulations, and there's also a lot of frustration that the existing regulations just aren't taken seriously by law enforcement. Which isn't to say that poaching or theft to make a quick buck isn't a problem at all. So this photo I actually took from a wildlife sanctuary in southern Ohio that has labels on most of their medicinal plants, but this is explaining that they have chosen not to label any of the ginseng that they have on their property because it was all stolen in 2006. So a lot of local people will sometimes they'll maintain a patch of ginseng that they will monitor, and sometimes people will come by and steal that. So a lot of people who grow ginseng, either wild simulated or otherwise, they have all kinds of plans for mitigating this risk of theft. You hear a lot about game cameras, decoy game cameras, because people will steal the regular game cameras, guns and dogs and everything like that. So by saying that over harvesting and theft aren't problems, that's not what I'm saying. they certainly are problems. They're just not the only problems that ginseng is facing right now. And so the solution to the population decline, according to my interlocutors, is a set of practices that they refer to as good stewardship. And concerns about ginseng harvesting have existed for a very long time. I mean, I even found some articles from the 1880s that were bringing up concerns about ginseng population decline in Appalachia. And so, like many societies around the world who rely on a common resource and have to figure out a way to prevent the tragedy of the commons, a lot of longtime Appalachians have developed a set of folk conservation strategies that they will refer to as good stewardship. So one of my interlocutors put it like this: I guess we're smart enough. We grew up in an agricultural setting, and I guess you just realize that things have to reseed. You're not reseeding, and then people just kind of started being a little more selective in the harvest. I'm not going to dig everything I find. I'm going to leave small roots. I'm not going to dig plants with green berries. And so not all Appalachian ginseng harvesters practice good stewardship. Like I just said, ginseng theft, indiscriminate harvest does still happen, but there is a locally defined set of best practices that exists for harvesting ginseng sustainably. And this could be the basis for a bottom-up rather than top-down approach to ginseng conservation. I also find the word stewardship really interesting. It implies a lot of interesting relationships of care. So there's this relationship between the steward and the thing that he or she is caring for, in this case, the ginseng in the mountains more broadly. It also contains this notion of guardianship or caretaking on behalf of another. So if you think about the historical term, origins of the word steward, it actually originally referred to as like the trusted servant who cared for a lord's estate or manor. But it also can be used to describe all sorts of people who care for things on behalf of others. So anything from like a wine steward to a financial steward. So if someone's a good steward of ginseng, on whose behalf are they caring for the ginseng? Future generations, God, the more than human assemblage that we might refer to as the Appalachian forest. Haven't fully answered these questions with this current project, but I plan to sort of think about this a little more deeply in some of my future work. And so to illustrate, here are some examples of good stewardship practices. Some of them are supported by the legal regulations and some of them are not. Some practices are more effective than others as well. And not everybody practices all of these. A lot depends on family tradition or who your ginseng digging mentor happened to have been. But a few common ones: harvest after the berries turn red. Seems obvious. But according to regulations, legal ginseng, regardless of when the berries ripen, is always September 1st. And so this one-size-fits-all approach, it's easy to administer consistently, but it greatly frustrates harvesters in areas where berries ripen much earlier in August. Plant seeds after harvest, also required by ginseng regulations. If you dig a plant, you have to take the seeds and replant them exactly where you found the plant. But it makes it a lot harder to establish new populations, especially if you're, say, harvesting from an area that is going to be logged or where there is a, housing development that's going to be built. So technically, taking those seeds and putting them elsewhere is technically illegal. Obtain seeds in bulk and plant widely. This is actually a contentious one. A lot of the time, people will buy seeds in bulk from these large-scale farms in Canada or Wisconsin and then just kind of scatter them around the woods all over the place. A lot of people will refer to themselves as like Johnny Appleseeds of ginseng. I really like this image of this Johnny Appleseed. But some folks will argue that this will contaminate wild populations with the farm-raised genetics. The degree to which that's actually happening is questionable. I'm actually working on a paper on that right now. Avoid harvesting these mother plants, these big plants that could reliably produce a lot of seed from year to year. On the other hand, these are also the plants with the biggest and most valuable roots, not addressed by formal regulations. Maintain a private ginseng patch by planting wild roots and seeds. Again, this runs up against regulations sometimes if you're transporting plants from the wild to elsewhere. Some folks will remove this neck, the portion of the root that contains these root scars and the bud of the next year's aerial parts of the plant, and then replant it. And then sometimes that will grow into a new root. You're technically not supposed to do this because you need to verify the age of the root by keeping that neck intact. So there are some folks who are very frustrated with the fact that they are not allowed to do this. And then finally, don't harvest everything. Some of the diggers who pride themselves on good stewardship will say they only harvest every third or fourth plant. They attribute this often to the Cherokee specifically. And again, this is not addressed by regulations, and it would be actually quite challenging to enforce in practice. And so throughout my work with ginseng diggers in Appalachia, I constantly hear this frustration that decision makers who develop rules and regulations don't adequately consult with the diggers themselves. They're based on the regulations are based on biological research, which some diggers say doesn't always accurately reflect what they encounter out in the woods. Skilled ginseng harvesters, they develop this ability to find and monitor ginseng over time, which is hard to replicate, say, over the time scale of a typical research grant or a PhD dissertation project. On the other hand, to be fair, ginseng diggers can be really hard to talk to. They're reluctant to talk to people who are perceived to be affiliated with, quote unquote, the government. That said, more communication with diggers about their folk conservation or good stewardship practices in developing regulations could lead to higher levels of compliance. So communication and education directly with diggers it's also a promising strategy, especially when the information is coming directly from somebody who they trust. So a trusted person like a local ginseng dealer or a more experienced digger. And then it also returns to this fact that one of the challenges is that, good jobs that pay a living wage are simply unavailable in a lot of parts of rural Appalachia, and digging ginseng can be an important income supplement. And so increased regulation that will exclude some of the poorest ginseng diggers while allowing people with land and money and resources to remain in the industry, that is also a problem. So in conclusion, I just want to offer some of my thoughts on why local Appalachian forest users haven't been a prominent voice in how ginseng regulations have been developed, or for that matter, how land use decisions in Appalachia have been made historically in the first place. And in recent years, especially with a lot of, now that there's a lot more attention on, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's a wonderful thing. And a lot of that has come with, some increased willingness on the part of, environmental NGOs, on a global scale, and environmental activists to, and even governments to take seriously traditional ecological knowledge, when it comes to, marginalized people making decisions about their lands and livelihoods. But what about in Appalachia? It can be difficult, I think, to sort of sift through a lot of the biases that we have about rural, conservative, poor, and working class people, and take seriously their knowledge about their local environment that has been developed over generations. And I will leave it there on that note. And thank you very much for listening. And I am happy to take any questions.
Right. Thank you, Kate, for that really wonderful talk. So we'll open up for questions right now. Does anyone have any questions?
Hi, great talk. Thanks so much. So I actually stumbled across ginseng at my study site here in Missouri this summer. I was really excited to figure out what it was. But if people have to hike so far to get to populations or to get to enough populations, are they also foraging other valuable things along the way, or do they typically just focus on ginseng?
It depends. Some people will just focus on ginseng. Some people will harvest ginseng while they're doing things like scouting out good places for deer hunting. And then some people will harvest ginseng while they're also looking for, for instance, on one of my trips out for harvesting ginseng, actually several trips that I've been on, we were also looking for golden seal, Hydrastis canadensis. which is another, not quite as valuable as ginseng, but it also will sell for quite a bit of money. And there's other plants too that grow in similar habitats as ginseng. And as long as people are familiar enough with the local plants, then yeah, they will also dig them.
Great, thanks. So we have questions from YouTube.
Yeah, so this question is from Suzanne Renner. She says, wonderful talk. Are there data on the time when berries develop and whether this has changed over the past 20 years?
Yes, there is. I don't know about any particular like papers off the top of my head, but there is a research group based out of West Virginia University that's done some quite extensive work on issues like that. So if you are interested in that, I mean, that information is definitely out there. I just don't have that, like, you know, right off the top of my head.
Thank you. Really great talk. If I understood correctly, you mentioned that root morphology is different between wild and farm ginseng, and that difference in morphology makes the farmed ginseng less valuable. Could you remind me what ginseng is used for, where its value comes from, and why that difference in morphology would affect value?
Yeah, so the difference in morphology is interesting because the difference in, I mean, so the biologically active component of ginseng is a class of alkaloids called ginsenosides, and they have been studied to, have a variety of, beneficial qualities in the human body. And so there is a difference in concentration of ginsenosides between wild and domesticated, or not domesticated, or wild and cultivated ginseng. And so the difference in morphology is thought to index potency. But it's not like, I mean, if you're selling the ginseng for 20 times more money, it does not mean that it's 20 times more valuable. So it also brings in a lot of sort of these, just ideas about what it means for something to be wild. So people will like invoke ideas like, because it's wild, it had to struggle, therefore it is stronger. So I am also going to like imbibe this plant and sort of like take in some of that strength. So, so some of this is like a little bit more symbolic than purely about just how strong it is.
Yeah, great talk. I was just wondering, like, how did you come to the word stewardship? Because to me, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but have you ever heard of like George Lakoff in World Politics?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it gave me very strong.
Stewardship is the word that my interlocutors use.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm just using that based on sort of they use it in fairly ubiquitously as well. Almost everybody refers to the word stewardship. So I'm hoping to sort of dig into that a little bit more. I think because some of that there's like a sort of a Christian kind of connotation to it as well. So but I think that that's actually something that would be worth thinking about in a bit more detail.
It struck me that both the governmental regulations and the stewardship practices might well work if everybody did them or if they're applied on private land, but there's still the social dilemma of cheaters and freeloaders who will exploit the populations. Is there any sort of local enforcement against those things?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, there's like, people will joke about, yeah, if you're in my ginseng patch, you got to watch out because, I've got a gun, basically. There's also just sort of informal methods of, enforcement, like shaming. People will tell rumors about other people, oh, this person's no good. Oh, dealers will say, I don't buy from this digger because I know for a fact that they dig from land where they're not supposed to be digging. So there are informal methods of enforcement as well.
Hi, thank you. That brings up a question because of the secrecy and the kind of lack of regulation around it. I was wondering if you've encountered any kind of organized crime around ginseng.
There were always stories about organized crime. People would tell stories about, oh, it's like the mafia or whatever, like the, some, various, East Asian organized crime groups who would be involved in one degree or another. What I encountered more, I mean, granted, I was not working at all on the Asian side of the supply chain. I was working exclusively in Appalachia, but I did encounter sort of small scale crime being associated with it. So for instance, one person who I spent actually quite a bit of time with, he was a drug dealer and explained that people would dig ginseng illegally out of season and then essentially barter it to him in exchange for pills or heroin. And then he would then turn around and then pretend that he had dug those roots legitimately in season and then sell them to a legitimate dealer. So it was basically a way to launder money. And so there was definitely stuff like that was happening.
Hi, so going back to the wild versus cultivated, how diagnostically accurate are those characteristics of the roots to differentiate? And do you know of any efforts? So you mentioned, I thought it was interesting that in the cultivated, they tried sort of to simulate the habitats, but do you know of any efforts to chemically alter growth hormones or something to make them look more wild looking?
There's a spectrum. I think that there are some people who will say definitively, oh yes, I can always tell which roots are wild and which ones are cultivated, but there really is a spectrum. And a lot of what I hear of what people are doing to, mimic this wild appearance, it'll be more stuff like, yeah, they will put on like fertilizers and stuff, but then they'll do stuff like plant the roots in like really rocky soil or like even like physically wrap roots around rocks to get this like gnarled appearance. So a lot of it's this more like physical manipulation. I haven't heard of people adding like specific hormones or anything like that.
Yeah, I heard the talk. I was just wondering, because they're harvesting these plants during different seasons, are people able to make enough money to sustain themselves throughout the year? Are they harvesting different things throughout the year? I kind of put together this puzzle of like scrap metal, other things that might be foraging and picking up along the way to make a livelihood.
Yeah, it depends. There's a small minority of people who will basically live in the woods for like weeks at a time. And like, that's all they do is like, they will harvest in season and they'll harvest ginseng when ginseng's in season, or they'll also harvest ginseng when ginseng's not in season. And, but also will harvest other stuff too. Most people will do it on a smaller scale. This is not their only income source. So a lot of people will talk about like they will harvest, a few pounds of ginseng and that will buy their heating oil for the winter, or that will buy their Christmas presents for their kids. Or like, people will talk about like, yeah, like school clothes, things like that. So it's like a supplementary income source, or they'll use it for emergencies. So, people will talk about maintaining a, private ginseng patch in like your family woodlot. And when somebody dies, that will pay for funeral expenses. So a lot of the time people don't just do one thing. They're cobbling together a livelihood out of a lot of different sources of income. So they're hunting, they're gardening, they're doing odd jobs. Sometimes they have formal employment, sometimes they don't. They lose their job, they'll do more ginseng harvesting, that kind of thing.
Hi, thanks. So you mentioned a lot of the supply chain is being sent out to China for and that's where a lot of the demand is coming from. And I was wondering if you encountered differences in how people viewed this resource as something that they're not typically consuming themselves in comparison to other things like mushrooms or hunting and other resources that they would be consuming themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd say probably about half of the people who I talked to do consume ginseng themselves in one capacity or another, maybe even a little bit more than that. A lot of the time for like when the people who consume it themselves, they would really focus on it as like, this is a stimulant, like this is going to give me extra energy. Or sometimes people would talk about it as like supposed to be like also just like male sexual potency enhancer. So they would talk about that too. So that would be like what the locals who I spoke with would use it for. And then if I asked them like, what do you think that the end consumers are using it for? I'd be like, oh, I don't know. Sort of this like inscrutable foreign thing that they're doing, and like, I just don't understand what it's used for.
All right, it's 5 p.m., so we're gonna wrap up, but as always, we'll have a reception afterwards, outdoors at Bader's Hall. So if you have more questions for Kate, please join us there, and then of course, like, just hang out there to socialize and have food and drinks. All right, thank you.